Hello again. Welcome back to the audio speech on Judaism today. Before I begin talking about the Judaic religion, I'd like to make a point that there are many ways to discuss this religion. But invariably, we need to discuss it historically. And by that, I mean not just in a secular way, but in a religious historical context. And by making this point, I also want to recognize that there are different types of Jewish perspectives. And our textbook recognizes different perspectives. For example, on page 376, they mention some Jewish names called Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. And those are different ways of practicing Judaism several hundred years back, or probably 1,000 years back. But then on page 383, we have a Kabbalah movement. On 384, we have Hasidism. On 387, we have Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism. And when I say Conservative Judaism, I don't really mean this in a political sense, like we might mean it in American politics. I don't mean it like that. Then on page 388, we have Reconstruction Judaism. And they're a very unique form of Judaism. One of the interesting varieties that they have in their modern day perspectives is that God is not necessarily transcendent anymore. In fact, God is found most likely in the world of nature. But that is a different point of view than I'm going to present. Also, we have on page 394 a humanist Judaism. And that's a pretty interesting point of view also, because that one suggests that you can be a Jew culturally, perhaps sociologically, and not even have a belief in a God or a creator God. And you can still be called a practitioner of Judaism. So with those small distinctions, we can see now that there are various ways of discussing Judaism. However, I'm going to take a modern day Orthodox point of view, and also it's Orthodox in a standard point of view. So now to begin to discuss this religion, I think this religion, because it's based upon faith, F-A-I-T-H, needs some background, some myth, M-Y-T-H, a way of telling the great truth. And in this particular religion, myth is the cornerstone of faith. And so when I say myth, I also mean a miracle. In fact, miracle is the main point. Miracles are found in this religion and in the Christian religion, and Islam has pretty much one basic miracle. But it starts, this concept of miracles, with the Judaic religion. Now, when I say the word miracle, I don't mean any disrespect now. I mean to imply something pretty phenomenal, pretty amazing, because a miracle is, by definition, against the laws of nature. And it's also against common sense. Now, when I say against the laws of nature, against common sense, I mean that is the point of calling it a miracle. Now, there are other types of Jewish interpretations. Like I mentioned, the Reform Jews, well, they will have a different point of view of what miracles are. They will give a quasi-scientific, plausible explanation, but that seems to miss the point of what I mean, the foundation of faith being based upon miracles. Now, how shall I also discuss the entire religion as a whole? Is to consider it as a giant family, which has been around for several thousand years. And when I say a family, I mean the development and the evolution of various points of view, evidenced by the references of the different names that I referred to right now. And when I say a family, I mean just like a regular family dynamics that we have among ourselves. We might get together as a family on a holiday of some sort, and we might have, politically speaking, conservative, progressive, liberals, libertarians, etc., within our family. And we might even have some lively conversation as we're sitting down to eat and chat among ourselves. But even if we disagree, we still are connected as a family. And so that's the bondage that's of interest to us to the course of quite a lot of years. It's called a covenant, but the covenant isn't just among the people, it is a covenant with God in the starting myth that I'm going to give us. Most of you are probably familiar with the story, I mean to say a myth, called Abraham and Sarah. Oh, it goes back a long ways. Now, again, some of the names I mentioned, like Reformed Jews, don't start off talking about this. Our textbook makes oblique references to this miracle routine, but it's a foundation of, like I said, faith. And let's see if we can appreciate the story and why this is an important starting point for faith-based religions. So as the story goes, Abraham lived a long time ago in Egypt, and it was called the Clan of Abe. During the time period that Abraham lived, he was rather an older man, 90 years old, and his wife Sarah, 8 years old. Now, during the time they lived in Egypt, the divine king concept was quite popular. That is, the king was considered divine, incarnate. That was just a belief that people had. But also, it wasn't the only religious belief. There was animism. People believed perhaps that some of the water creatures around the Nile River were also representations of divine beings. So the milieu of the time period was pretty, I should say, liberal-minded in terms of God's being and spirits being around us in the physical manifestations. Again, as a human being, the divine king walking around maybe Heliopolis, or maybe some people believe in, like I say, animals were representations of spirit beings. That's called animism. So Abraham and his clan are old. Now, because the laws of nature are constant, so people then and now haven't changed much. I mean, we dress different, but we still have basic examples of humanity and common sense. So you would not need a PhD then or now to understand my next point. When people get to be a certain age, I'm thinking 90 and 80 years old is a good general point to make, certain biological functions are not going to happen anymore. In particular, procreation is not going to be happening. It's just the laws of nature. And again, people know this by common sense. So when Abraham is out in the desert and he's either getting a vision or he's spoken to by a God, or he believes it's the voice of a God, and he's now instructed that he's going to have to lay with his wife and make a child, and he starts to tell this to his clan. I don't know about you, but that would be a pretty shocking thing to be told. Now, remember, we're looking at this story not now from 2022, but going back in time. And to appreciate the point of view I'm giving you, imagine now you have neighbors and they're nice folks, but they're in their 80s and 90s, and you're outside talking to them one day, and you ask them how they're doing, and they're saying fine, and you're chit-chatting with them, and they're healthy enough for the age that they are, and but they tell you, oh, by the way, we're thinking of having a child. I mean, what kind of reaction do you think you would have? I'm pretty much betting that you would be thinking that it's just physically not possible in your head. You might be kind and say that's nice, but commonsensically, it's against the laws of nature. It's just that's the point. So anyway, I think the same attitude must have been expressed by Abe's clan, and of course Sarah, because she was barren, would have a hard time even knowing, I would imagine, by the laws of nature, if she was pregnant. So now, as the story goes on, the people of the clan and the tribe eventually come to believe that Sarah is pregnant. And what's the fundamental point of the story? Well, the transcendent God, which is being referred to right here, the clan of Abe, didn't have a real special name. Sometimes called the God of Abe, sometimes was called El Roy, the seeing God, El Shaddai, the mighty God, El Elyon, exalted God, different names because it was not a God you could see. Again, contrast that with the animistic point of view, or the divine king walking around, like I say, Heliopolis. And so Abraham's starting point is rather difficult to grab hold of for ordinary way of thinking. But if you're in the tent and the 80-year-old lady, Sarah, the wife, gives birth, and I presume a healthy, let's just say for the story here, 8-pound boy, that's an amazing story. And if you were in the tent and you saw that with your eyes, you would believe. How could you not believe? You see it, right? It's not a magic act. And this is the point of what's called a miracle. No matter how hard we try and think about this, it just goes against the laws of nature, against common sense. So now let's go a little further with the story of Abraham and Sarah. The tribe now, according to Abraham, and the way the story goes, has now a covenant. It's a deal with God, the transcendent God that nobody can see just yet, and that God will guarantee the permanent existence of the Judaic religion and the Judaic people on earth for eternity. That's a pretty big deal, because when you look around all the other tribes of the nations, of all the different kind of historical people we've had on earth, it's hard to imagine that they're still around exactly as they were several thousand years ago, just by the laws of evolution. So this is a big deal. Well, and of course you can imagine now that the clan of Abraham tribe telling the local people of what miracle they saw, that they must have been thought they were a bit odd talking like this, of course, right? Because they understand common sense. So anyway, the tribe of Abraham becomes more popular, populous by more people, and eventually becomes friends with a group called the Hesoks. This is quite a long time, of years later. And then what happens is Egypt, or the divine king of Egypt, has a battle with the Hesoks, conquers them, but also takes them, and at this point in time now, they were called Hebrews, they weren't called Israelites or Jews. He takes them all as slaves. And this is an interesting story because now we have the king killing the firstborn boys of the Hebrews for population control, right? And that way you keep your enemies subdued, and making the Hebrews free labor, working on the pyramids or whatever the king's projects were for that time period, right? And of course, you can see that the Hebrews who were told by the ancestors of Abraham and Sarah that they were going to exist on earth for eternity are being challenged because, well, the firstborn sons are being killed and they're enslaved. So it seems very difficult to see how this is going to work out for them. And as we now move into this development of this myth a little bit better, we have this Moses comes into the picture. Now, Moses, as you know, they show this movie every year on TV, and it's a nice movie. It's historically pretty accurate. And Moses lived with the Midianites after he had killed one of the king's guards defending one of the the Hebrews who was being beaten up by the king's guards. And of course, that was a very terrible thing. So he had to leave. And so years later, Moses is told by God again, in the burning bush example, that you should go to the king and have the king release my people. Again, this is part of the covenant story. And you have to imagine now that the king has audiences and has people come to complain and make settlements, etc. So enter Moses with his brother Aaron, and now he's telling the king that his God, the God of Moses, is coming to give the divine king a message to let his people go. And you know, we had free labor here, as I said a few minutes ago. The king is probably saying, so what are you going to give me? Well, nothing, just let him go. Well, you see, that's not going to work out very well. And so then, as the story goes, Moses takes a staff and throws it on the ground to prove the power of his God, and the staff turns into a snake. But the king, as the myth goes, is also divine and has one of his alchemists throw a staff on the ground and it turns into a snake. And then the snake that came from the staff of Moses eats the snake that comes from the king's side to show symbolically that the Moses God is more powerful. Now, I don't know about you, but when you start thinking about these images, which are interesting, how is it possible a stick can turn into a snake against all common sense and against all laws of nature? And anyway, the king does not relent. He doesn't relent. He doesn't want to give it up. And as time moves on, as you might remember some of the stories here, the king's plagued with different kinds of problems. Water turns to blood. Some of the people are very sick with boils. Locusts come and eat the grains. These are signs that the God of Moses is trying to show more powerful by using the laws of nature to show that he's got control over nature, right? As opposed to the spirits of the animistic believers, or as opposed to the divine king who shows no powers over the laws of over nature to begin with, right? So that's an important part there from the Moses point of view of the God. But comes the more serious part now. So Moses is told to tell his people that tonight, kill a goat of some kind or some kind of an animal sacrifice, take some brush and smear it with blood and paint the front of your door with some blood, with the blood of your sacrifice. And then when the angel of death comes around midnight and sees the mark of blood on the door, the angel of death will pass over that door and not go inside and kill anybody. Okay, well, as you might remember, they all do this, the Hebrews, but then those who don't have the doors painted with blood, the angel of death goes inside and kills the firstborn boys. And this also will include the king's son. Now, to understand the seriousness of this point, which is called the Passover, and it's a ceremony which is celebrated every year by not only the Jews, but also the Christians. We should imagine what we're discussing here a little bit more clear. Moses' God is transcendent. That is to say, we can't see him, it's very far away. So it's a different point of view of a kind of God than at that time period. But just right now, in any one given day in California, in the year 2022, you can imagine just by laws of nature that probably 1 or 2 babies are dead by natural causes. or maybe crib death. These are just things that happen. One of the biggest states in the nation here, and we have a lot of people and just the laws of averages, right? But in order to understand how serious this point is about the Passover, it cannot be just one or two babies. It's got to be that the king and all the Hebrews and everyone is woken up in the middle of the night, middle of the morning, early morning, to mothers yelling at the top of their lungs, fathers in anguish, because must be many, many, many babies must be dead. Must be. Otherwise, there's no point to the story. And includes also the king's son, who is by definition divine because his dad is divine blood also. Well, so now we see a point here. They're not going to stick around in town anymore because everyone in the neighborhood knows the battle between Moses and the king. And so the Hebrews leave town pretty quick because it's pretty obvious what's going on. So they live in haste. But what's important is that when they talk on the ceremonies of sandals and tightened belts and stuff, of course you can leave in haste, because what? Lots and lots of babies are dead. That's the main point. Now, after that, the king sends his men to go find Moses and probably get retribution. Well, as the story goes, they're being hunted by the king's men, and the king, I think, is also with them. And then they come to the river, and they can't really cross the river because, well, they got old people with them. They got brand new babies were just born like a couple of days ago. And so they're not swimmers. They don't have any rafts. And lo and behold, the river parts. And so they walk. And so you have to imagine the water, like, I guess, splashing, but now it's opened up in two pieces. And they go walk by safely. And in the story that I'm presenting to you right now, the king's men come upon the scene. And you have to now understand how interesting this story is, because there are the king's men, an army, who have conquered pretty much all of Egypt for a couple thousand years. And now you see this water breaking in two. I'm imagining if I'm on a horse or in a chariot, I'm thinking, that looks like a trap to me. I'm not going to go through that. That's pretty weird. And of course, they go through it. And that is just the most amazing thing. I would think they would send a scouting troop first, but not the entire army in it, right? Send a scouting troop to see if it's going to be stable enough to go through. But of course, that's not how it works out. Now, what's interesting about this is, of course, those events I've just discussed here right now are against the laws of nature, every one of them. Numerically, water breaking in two is just not going to happen. And then after a while, Moses and his tribe end up in Mount Sinai, and now the Ten Commandments. Now, why are the Ten Commandments such a big deal? Well, paraphrasing the first commandment, thou shalt have no false gods before me. Well, that's an important commandment, because now this myth, which is a source of faith based upon miracles, has now given you, if you're in the Orthodox point of view, a clear message for all of history, for the entire length of the covenant that you are now made to deal with God. And what is that fundamental piece of knowledge? That your God has killed a divine king's son. So any God or anyone coming in the shape of flesh and blood, claiming to be God, or people saying he's God, right now, this story has proved that to be false. And that's what the first commandment says. So we can see, with this Orthodox point of view, a sharp division between Judaism and Christianity. Christianity, of course, will evolve from Judaism, but the difficulty lies in the concept of how to think of God. And so anything in the flesh being divine already is precluded because of the story with Moses. And this point here is about miracles. And again, like I made a point a few minutes ago, that when you look in the book and you read different types of Judaic points of view, they're not all going to say the same thing. Here, let me give you a point of view from a Reform Judaic view about the story of Moses and how they will use maybe a more scientific, plausible explanation. When I talk to them, they will tell me that when Moses was living with the Midianites and was married to Zipporah, he was always watching the phases of the moon and observing that when the moon was bright, water would recede. It affects the tides of the oceans. The moon does. That's a physical fact. And that if you looked at the ecological evidence, you could see along the riverbanks, by those who can understand sedimentary tracking better than I can, will show you at what particular time of the year, what month of the year, there was more water in the riverbed and less, and it will coincide with the phases of the moon. And that's a pretty interesting point, and I think it's probably quite right. And then the point that the Reformed Jew would be telling me is that, and so when Moses got confronted with the river, he timed it so that it would be with the full moon, the water to be at the lowest ebb, lowest level, and they could walk across. And then by the time the king's men came with their chariots and wagons, they got stuck in the mud and the water came back up and drowned them, right? And that is a plausible and reasonable explanation. There's no doubt about that. But then if you take that point of view, it's not really a hardline view of what a miracle is. And why? Because it's understandable and it's plausible. And it's maybe it's a little bit of common sense there too, right? So when you read the textbook, you'll see that different types of Judaic practitioners will say different things about the historical past. And so that's what I wanted to tell you was about the miracles as a foundation for this faith-based religion. And I think that would be enough. In the posted lecture that I give you, I mentioned the miracles. I also mentioned something about a concept called human nature, and that has to do with the concept of sin. And just a couple of quick words on that. The point of view with Adam and Eve is that from the Orthodox point of view, God made Adam and Eve a certain way. And which way is that? Well, by human nature, we are able to go against commands. We are made as human beings to go against commands. We're not made to be agreeing to every command. And we see evidence of this all the time. Just watch people text and drive. You can see that all the time. Or people drink and drive. You see it all the time. So we are, as people, are made to go against commands. So the idea of human nature needing a savior, the Orthodox point of view, we don't need one. And why? Because we're not born defective, which is the concept which is reserved for some other religion. In the case of the Judaic point of view, all the desires we have and all of our passions are gifts from God, and they're to be used properly, and we should be guided by the Torah. The Torah will guide us how to use the passions and desires. And it is only when we go against a mitzvah, which means command, when we are actually going to be called sinners. And having, from the Jewish point of view, desires and fantasies, there's nothing wrong with that. It's only when you break a covenant. For example, if you make a marriage vow, that's a covenant. And so when you break that, that's a sin, right? You broke it. You gave way to your passions and desires, and you knowingly broke a covenant, right? So it's something as simple as that. It's not complicated here. But anyway, I thought I would just broach the subject there because sometimes people believe that from one religion to another religion, that there are some similarities, but these 2 points I just mentioned to you right now, about the commandment, first commandment, and the nature of mankind, mark fundamental differences between this religion and a few others. Okay, so I've talked quite a bit now. I think now I just remind you that when you read the textbook, try to keep in mind that you are reading different views of what it's like to be a practitioner of this faith, and see if you can appreciate the concept of miracles in relationship with my published lecture, and see if you can find some tie-ins to the textbook. All right, I think that's enough for today. Thank you very much.